been a long day, so help me out here for a second. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. We do that, right? Usually we just do 2 claps, but thank you for your enthusiasm. We do that because that's what we're supposed to do, right? We sing that song to children all the time. But if you think about it, it's actually a really complex instruction. I'm asking you to have the depth of self-awareness to access your most core and fundamental human emotion, to evaluate it, to acknowledge it, and to articulate your response in the form of a clap. But are we happy? And do we know it? When I was 24, I was awarded a scholarship to write my PhD in psychology. The only caveat was that it had to be in the area of subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is the scientific term for what we know as our happiness. And so I began to think about who the happiest people were that I know. And it didn't take me long to come up with who that was. This is a picture of my grandfather. I called him my Zayda. His name was Szymon Michałowicz, and he was born on the 2nd of December in 1929 in a town called Wieleń in Poland. He was 9 years old when World War II began. He was 10 when he was separated from his mother. And he was a boy of just 11 when he stood in front of Nazi guards at Auschwitz. He was deemed eligible to work, and so he was transported to Blechamer, where he endured years of forced labour and starvation, until finally he was sent on a death march to Buchenwald. And from there he was eventually liberated by the US Army on the 11th of April 1945. The reason I tell you this story is because when people hear that I'm a happiness researcher, they think that I sit in an office filled with butterflies and rainbows. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Everything that I know about well-being and about happiness comes from the study of trauma. And I was struck by the irony that the person who I knew that was happiest was also the one who had suffered the most. And as I began researching the psychology of Holocaust survivors, I found I couldn't connect with it at all. It was full of pathology. The literature I was reading was about how survivors were irreparably damaged and how they would never be able to trust another human being again after what happened to them. But that didn't describe my Zayda. My Zayda made his way out to Australia. He found a wife in my grandmother. He forged a career. He became a builder. He had a family. He sang and he danced and he celebrated life and he loved. Let me tell you what I understand about happiness. First of all, there are 2 things that we need to know. There are 2 types of happiness. The first is the short-term type of happiness. It's the type that we're probably most familiar with. It's the type of happiness that we feel in response to something good happening. So we take a bite out of a piece of chocolate, or we have a nice meal, or ladies, we buy a new pair of shoes. It's that buzz that we get. For me, it's the rush that I get from spending time with my nieces and nephew. But it's short-term, right? As soon as the happy stimulus is removed, the smile fades and our happiness subsides. The other type of happiness is a longer-term happiness. It's more of a stable, underlying sense of contentment. It's the sort of happiness that we feel when we're not really thinking about it at all. It's just there. And that's the type of happiness that we talk about in the science as subjective well-being, and it's much more resistant to change. So if that's what happiness is, how do we measure it? The simplest and probably the easiest way to capture it is using a single item, and I'll put it to you now. On a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 means you're not at all satisfied and 10 means you're completely satisfied, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? Now, it shouldn't take you long to come up with your answer. And if your answer was anything below a 4, we should probably talk outside afterwards. But if you answered a 7 or an 8, raise your hand. The reason I know this is because we've actually been asking this question to thousands and thousands of Australians since 2001 as part of a project called the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index. This index was devised to monitor the wellbeing of the Australian population, and so we've tracked the nation's happiness over the last 15 years. And what you'll see in this figure, if you trace the little red line, is that our happiness, our average happiness level goes up, goes down, stays the same for a bit, goes up again, stays the same. What's really remarkable about this graph is that the range within which our average happiness level is fluctuating is only about 3 percentage points. The average happiness score for the Australian population since 2001 has only fluctuated between 73.9% and 76.7%. Now, when something is as stable and predictable as this, it suggests that there's some sort of underlying mechanism operating to keep it regular. In the literature, it's called the homeostasis theory of subjective well-being. And the best way that I can describe it to you is to liken it to another homeostatic mechanism that we're all more familiar with. Let's talk for a minute about body temperature. Our body temperature is always there in the background, and we're not really usually aware of it until something happens to bring it to our awareness. Now, our body temperature is set at 37 degrees, right? But it's able to fluctuate around that a little bit. So, like today, we sit here and our body temperature goes up. What does our body do? Our body acts, it engages an automatic physiological process like sweating to cool us back down. We can facilitate that process by perhaps taking off a layer of clothing. Now, the other way, when our body temperature gets a little bit cold, our body shivers. That's our body's attempt to restore its normal level. If we need to, we can add on another layer of clothing to facilitate that process. What if I told you that happiness had a set point too? And what if I told you, let's say, just for argument's sake, that that happiness level was at 75 degrees or 75%? Our happiness can go up. We can have some sort of short-term happy reaction to something, as we know. But as soon as we get accustomed to that stimulus, it comes back down. Our happiness can go down as well. Right? Things happen every day to make us feel a little bit sad. An easy example, we're walking down the street and we spill a cup of coffee. We get down on ourselves, we feel annoyed, but we say to ourselves, it's okay, I'm good at other things. Or we say, I knew that was going to happen, I was trying to carry too much. We engage in automatic psychological processes like self-esteem and a sense of control over our world to restore our happiness to its optimal level. Now, whenever I present this information, I get asked this question: why can't we be 100% happy? Happiness is good, right? So shouldn't more of it be better? There's actually a large body of scientific literature dedicated to the power of negative emotions. When researchers have induced positive and negative moods into people, we find that happy people aren't always better off. People who are in happier moods make all sorts of mistakes. They spend money that they wouldn't otherwise spend. They take more risks. They become foolish and make false memories. And they're actually more selfish in social situations. On the other hand, people who have a negative mood induced actually pay more attention to detail, they can become more motivated, and they're even more effective communicators. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be positive, but we have to understand that there's a huge power in negative emotions as well. And there's actually no evidence in the scientific literature that you can take a person who is already experiencing a normal level of happiness and make them chronically happier. And so, as a scientist, I'm constantly frustrated by the way that we understand happiness in society these days and the way that we talk about it. On the one hand, there's secret to happiness, right? There's a secret that it's some sort of elusive phenomenon at the end of a rainbow. On the other hand, we can all be happy. We just have to work for it. It's confusing, these messages. And so, like you, I imagine, I feel annoyed sometimes when I see all these positive mantras out there flooding social media, saying things like, people are just as happy as they make up their minds to be. Like it's that simple, and we should just choose to be happy. When we're talking in psychology about moods and about affect. These can be real problems. Psychological pain is real. You wouldn't take somebody who has a gaping wound to their leg and is bleeding profusely and tell them just to choose to stop bleeding. So why don't we treat psychological pain in the same way? We've all heard the big forgiveness movement. Just forgive and you'll be happy. Let me tell you what my grandfather said about forgiveness. I asked him a few years ago whether he would ever forgive the Nazis for what they did to him. And he said to me, I don't hate them because it would only hurt me to feel hate. But I don't forgive them either, because forgiving says that it's okay what they did, that I understand what they did to me. And it's not okay. He said in particular there were 3 things that he could never forgive them for. The first was that they took him away from his mother. The second was that they robbed him of his childhood. And the third was that they denied him of the opportunity for a proper education. And since then, I've always thought that for a man who never had a proper education, he said some really clever things. What about this one? Surround yourself with positive people. All right? Let's create exclusive groups of happy, annoying people. And let's not let the negative ones in. Social support is the #1 determinant of well-being. And I worry that when we surround ourselves with positive people, we forget about all the people who really need our help. There's a very good reason why we're not 100% happy and why we're meant to be at about 75%. But why is it that we can so easily accept that our body temperature has an optimal level that shouldn't be exceeded, but we don't want to accept that for our happiness? We all understand that we have to feel negative, that it's part of our emotional repertoire. But we keep pushing for these short-term gains and expecting long-term change. Why can't we just be content with being content? Why isn't it okay to just be okay? Most of the time, we are happy. Just sometimes, we don't know it. Thank you.